Well, welcome everybody. Let's get started so we can have a good, active conversation. I'm Mickey Edwards. Welcome to the Aspen Institute for the conversation. This is the first of a series of seminars that we at the Institute are doing with the Bipartisan Policy Center, exploring the questions about civility and the nature of the political system we have now, and whether it's working for us and whether it's capable of dealing with the problems that we have in our society. Just a couple of quick rules, and then I'm going to ask Jason Grumet, who's the president of the Bipartisan Policy Center, to join in welcoming you. We will turn to all of you for conversation after some conversation with the panelists. And you will have to do two things. To speak, you'll have to, this is obvious, you have to push the little button for your microphone to be turned on. More important, when you're through speaking, you have to push it again. And I'm told the reason is because you can only have so many microphones on at once. And if we have too many, the next person won't be able to speak. We're going to try to be brief. When you speak, we want you to identify yourself and make your comments brief, and hopefully the answers will be brief. So Jason Grumet from the Bipartisan Policy Center, who's co-sponsoring this with us.
Well, let me just add my words of welcome. The one thing among many that the Aspen Institute does so wonderfully is bring together rooms like this. I think that amongst us, there is a deep amount of commitment and a deep appreciation for the fact that while our democracy is animated by a clash of ideas, we need not bring along the bitterness that often comes with those disagreements if, in fact, we want to forge public policy. And this is really one of the basic core ideas of the Bipartisan Policy Center. I know it's something that everybody here embraces. It will not come as a surprise to anyone that Mickey and others started having this conversation in those terrible weeks after the violence in Tucson. At those moments, of course, that's when the country reflects and decides that it can do better. As we also find, though, absent a concrete opportunity to channel that goodwill into a real meaningful outcome, those moments fade. And we decided a few months ago that we thought it was important to set up a series of these discussions with people who have, we hope, some very specific ideas to see if we could in fact capture that shared understanding, shared sense that we have a lot more in common than what has divided us in the past, and see if beyond that kind of noble rhetoric, which is easy to espouse, we could actually come up with some specific ideas. And so I think the point of this first session is to have a broader discussion to try to frame those ideas. But then we do intend to have a series of follow-up seminars where we try to really drill down on some more specific questions to see if, in fact, we can make what we believe would be discrete and specific proposals that, while none unto themselves will change the arc of our democracy, could start to show some meaningful progress in specific areas. And so that's really what our not humble aspirations are for this exercise. It's nice to be sitting next to Senator Warner. Great to see Senator Bennett, who has graced us as a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I saw Congressman Hertel and Connie Morella, who have been doing great work with the former members of Congress Association. I mean, this is a group of people. It's kind of the if not us, who moment. This is when the co-pilot says, we're going to Cleveland. If you don't plan on going to Cleveland, you're on the wrong plane. We need to figure out, in addition to how much we agree about, whether we can really now kind of find some meaningful, specific ideas that we could all get behind and try to make something of, I think, this sense of shared interest. So I appreciate your time, know it's valuable, and now I'd like to hand it back to, we are in the house that Mickey built, to Mickey to lead the conversation.
Thanks, Jason. What we need to do to explore this whole question is, first of all, is it different? Is it different than what it's been in the past? Is the incivility that people talk about really worse than Hamilton faced and Jefferson faced, or LBJ and Goldwater faced, or all the various kinds of problems where we've had incivility and nastiness in our politics in the past? Does our system still work, or does the polarization, has it reached a point that it has become too difficult for our elected officials to be able to grapple with the very real problems that we have? So it's not only are we more uncivil, but does it matter Is it really having an impact on our ability to govern ourselves? And if so, as Jason said, what do we do about it? Not going to give real introductions of the panel, first of all, because you know them, but second, because you also have their bios in front of you. The only thing I will add to that before I turn to them, we have at the Aspen Institute of Programs, the Rodell program, where every year we go out and we seek the best young rising political stars in America who we think have the best promise for our society, who are thoughtful, intelligent, willing to work across the aisle and represent the best in politics. We pick 24 each year, and in our first class, Trey Grayson was one of those members, then the Secretary of State in Kentucky. The second class, Jack Markell, who was then the State Treasurer in Delaware and is now the Governor. All during that time, and all during the time I was in Congress, and since, if you really wanted to know what was going on without the bias and without the incivility, you listened to Cokie Roberts. And so I don't know where we could have a better start. But let me try to frame the situation this way. We have had periods of incivility, obviously, in the past. We certainly have had polarization. And probably to ask for an end to polarization, widely divergent political views, strongly felt, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense in a nation of 300 million people, very diverse society with different backgrounds and different interests. What role has partisanship played? What role has the media played? The party identity issue. What about our political system itself with closed primaries and those kinds of issues? So we want to explore all of that. It's also, I think, important for us to think in terms of what's the goal. I mean, are we looking for consensus, which strikes me as being fairly impossible to achieve among 300 million people, probably impossible to achieve, among the people around this table on many things, but the ability to compromise, to sit down with people who don't start out where you are and find a way to talk to each other, to listen to each other, to be civil, to have the kind of civil society Aristotle wanted us to have. Are we able to get there? So I'm going to just ask some questions just to get this conversation started. And I'm going to turn first to Jack Markell, the Governor of Delaware. Jack, there is this sense often that what we have is this incivility at the elite level in Washington, inside the Beltway, the members of Congress in the House and the Senate, the press, and that's what's causing the problem. But your own state of Delaware was a pretty good indication that the problems are not all in Washington. Looking at the election you had, the primary election there, and Delaware is obviously a state that would vote Republican sometimes, Democrat sometimes, views strongly felt. The Christine O'Donnell race against Mike Castle highlighted some of the deep divisions. What effect is that having on the ability to govern, the ability to actually make government work?
Well, first I want to thank you, Mickey, for inviting me and having me as part of the panel. A spirited debate between smart people is what our democracy has always been about. That being said, it does feel a little bit different today than it did when I think back not so long ago when President Reagan was president, working with Tip O'Neill. They probably disagreed on most things politically, but they seemed to be able to figure out a way to get things done. I think you have to be careful about drawing conclusions or extrapolating. And in the case of the Delaware election, let's face it, so Christine O'Donnell won the Republican nomination to the Senate. The Republicans have about 31% of registration in Delaware. About 30% of them, I think, turned out, maybe 40%. And she won with a 53% majority. It was really very few people. And so in the end, things tend to go back to normal. And so she was never a real candidate. She lost badly in the election. And in fact, it's the one state, one of the few states where Democrats actually gained ground in the 2010 election. So I think her victory in that election had virtually has had no impact in terms of how we get things done within state government. And that being said, I do think it's a little bit different in a small state. We have to be a bit more civil to each other because there's a good chance that my kids are going to go to school with the kids of the person I'm running against, that we're going to run into each other at the grocery store, and I think there's just a tendency in a smaller state to treat each other a little bit differently. So I think you also can't extrapolate, therefore, from a small state to a big state. But I do think there's a lot that we can explore in this conversation about what kinds of lessons we can learn.
Trey, well, I mean, I pointed to Delaware as a place where, you know, all of this came to a boil. You know, I could have pointed to Kentucky as well, since Kentucky was one of the more interesting states politically. But I want you to focus on one thing, Trey, and that is, as Secretary of State, and then as the president of the National Association of Secretaries of State, you're dealing with the people who manage the election process, which of course results in whatever it is we have in Washington or in the state legislatures. And it was my feeling that the election process and the way people relate to each other has changed considerably. When I was first elected to Congress, there was a cardinal rule in campaigning, which was that if somebody said something very bad about you, you kept your mouth shut. You did not give it legs. You didn't give it credibility. You didn't answer it. And today it seems that if you are attacked, you have to answer it immediately because it's believed, which suggests some change in the attitudes of the public itself and their attitudes toward the people who run for office. So given that and watching the elections the way you have done before you went to the Institute of Politics, you know, what do you see about the system and its ability to produce people who are willing to sit down and work with each other?
Thank you for the question and for the invitation. And I thought I was going to get away without alluding to the fact that it's my fault that Rand Paul's in Washington, D.C. But I guess not. That's how I introduced myself on campus at Harvard. It goes really well with the Democrats on campus there, and the Republicans laugh, so it works out pretty well. You know, I think one of the things that there are several elements to your question, and I think if you think about the administration of elections, one of the things that's really striking since the 2000 presidential race is how much more attention both candidates and sort of political operatives, but also the public is paying to these close election outcomes. I mean, I know I would not be surprised if many folks in this room were watching that Wisconsin Supreme Court race pretty closely as those results came in. And people are paying more attention to the rules and how the rules impact outcomes. And whether it's a closed primary like in Delaware or, you know, unfortunately what happened with Senator Bennett in Utah with a convention where it was even smaller number of participants that were able to impact public policy, how our elections are not only administered, but more importantly, the rules of elections definitely impact the type of candidate that is elected. We were talking in the green room, and I know that I've talked to some of the members of the Kentucky delegation who are Republicans, and as we're going through these budget debates in Washington right now, they all have their eyes on the right flank from a Tea Party-based candidate. I mean, they saw what happened to me in Kentucky. They see what happens to other people. And in a low turnout primary, it can definitely impact the results. The flip side of that is, you know, you got to always look for signs of hope, and that you know, we do have a Senate, for example, that has 6-year terms, and I think that gives an ability for the senators to act a little bit more independently. So there are rules that I think that can continue to promote, you know, promote good candidates, and you know, we have a big election in 2012 that I think we'll learn a lot more about this. But the rules and having people trust the outcome, trust the system. When I was Secretary of State, that was always key. I wanted Republicans and Democrats to trust that the outcome was the right outcome. And I remember one of the last things I did in office, and we had a very close congressional race last fall, and I was on the phone with both the Republican and Democratic candidate explaining the rules to them personally, and they both trusted me, and neither went to the media kind of complaining or observing, and that was something that I felt as a Secretary of State that was my job. That was a no-brainer. And sometimes I think we see election administrators who don't always act that way, and that taints the process, which makes it even more difficult when people look at the situation.
Cokie, I'm going to move in a different direction. There is a lot of focus on what happens in Washington, and a lot of focus on the election results of that. And there's a question about whether or not this incivility, if it exists, is at the top, has some ramifications in Congress and so forth, or whether it's boiling up from the bottom. And several years ago, Bill Bishop, who's a reporter, was a reporter in Austin, Texas, wrote a book called The Big Sort, and found that in his studies, what was happening was not that, Barack Obama had suggested, and I cheered him for this, I thought it was a great statement, that there's not a red America, not a blue America, there's the United States of America. But I'm not sure it's true, because there are areas that are very, very red and very blue, and a lot of people who tend to live just with people who think like themselves, and they're not open to other kinds of views. So part of it is what you see in the country itself in terms of civility or lack of civility, and then flowing from that, the role of the media, if there is one, I mean, NPR and all of your affiliations aside, where people tend to, it seems to me, look for reinforcement rather than news. And so there's some question about the role that the media plays in causing this.
Well, I mean, I think it's huge, but I can't let your comment about whether it is less civil now than it was, for instance, for Hamilton go by, because he saw incivility up close and personal at the point of a gun, and that was over political speech. So we are certainly in better shape now than we were then, when people called each other out on the floor of the House of Representatives and went to Bladensburg and murdered each other. I mean, Hamilton Burr was just the most famous of it. So I do think that it's worth putting it in some kind of a perspective. But in terms of the populace being, polarized and rude, and I'm so tended to blame their mothers for, not bringing them up right. But why should women take the burden? But it's certainly true. You see it. I mean, things live on the internet that are so unacceptable to me, and people say things that I'm not sure they would say if they were identified, but since they're anonymous, they feel quite free to say things. And certainly we have news organizations and people inside news organizations who are yelling and screaming from various perspectives. But again, we have always had that. I mean, our press at the time that the First Amendment was written couldn't have been ruder and more outrageous and making stuff up and putting lies in the paper. I will make the case that I think television is more pervasive than newspapers were, but still, we shouldn't get too upset about what's happening now when you look at what happened in the past. I think that there are two things happening, though, in terms of the body politic at the same time, and one is this anger and this sense of my way or the highway and all of that. But at the same time that you see that happening in terms of politics, on personal levels, you see far more tolerance than we've ever seen before in our society, so that people are much more willing to accept interracial marriage and interracial dating. The changes in people's attitudes about gay marriage have been just incredible in a very, very short period of time. So that there's sort of two things going on at the same time that seem contradictory. And my guess is that and of course the polling shows this, is that the vast majority of people are tolerant, moderate people who just want people in Washington to come here and behave. And then you have the great polarization, which results in the people who get elected.
So, let me turn back to Jack here. Is the problem, if what Cokie says is correct, if the incivility that we're all concerned about is actually less than it's been in the past, that we've certainly seen worse examples, when I'm in the House chamber and I walk upstairs where I've seen the blood stains on the stairs, and I'm glad it wasn't me. If things are in fact better in terms of how people interact with each other, certainly on non-political matters and some of these political matters. Is it the system? Are we somehow producing in our elective offices unrepresentative people who don't reflect what's happening in their societies?
Well, I think there's a shared responsibility. I think the voters have a responsibility to make sure that the people they elect know exactly what it is that they want them to do, which is to focus on solving real problems that make a difference in everyday life. I do think there's a media responsibility, and Cokie talked about the journalists in the past and what the journalists themselves have said, but also I think in a world, and this of course has now become a cliche, but in a world of all these cable channels, and it does seem that the person who yells the loudest and is the most ridiculous gets the most attention. And without any disrespect to any particular candidate, I think if you look at what's happened over the last month in terms of Donald Trump and where he has moved in the polls, I mean, I think you see a little bit of that. So I do think that if you think about some of the shows these days, I mean, certainly NPR, shows like Morning Joe, where they take a longer period of time to try to explore these debates in a thoughtful way, I think are important. But I think there's also a significant responsibility on the part of the elected officials themselves. Somebody has got to be the grown-up in the room. And I think that is what is so often missing. And I do still put a lot of faith, I certainly do. I know that the electorate in Delaware better than elsewhere, but I think you could say the same thing across the country. Maybe not in a narrow primary, and maybe not in a closed, narrow primary, but over the course of an entire electorate in a state or certainly for the country, people are looking for folks to stand up and solve problems. And I think actually some of the kinds of conversations that the Aspen Institute brings together. One specific example that I can relate to in Delaware, we had my first legislative session, so 2 years ago, a little bit less than 2 years ago. My legislature, both the House and Senate, overwhelmingly passed a bill to get rid of our bottle bill. And that's basically, we thought the effect of that would be to have a lot more litter on the streets. But it was broken. The bottle bill was broken. And so that was my first veto. I vetoed that bill. And thanks, there's a program here at Aspen called, I think it's the CATO program, brings together people from different perspectives in the environmental field. And my Secretary of Natural Resources went through that. And we brought together every party, the retailers, the bottlers, and the environmentalists. I mean, it really was one of the most complicated things that we've done. And when I vetoed that bill, I said, I recognize that it's broken, but I want to replace it with something that's better. And that something better, from my perspective, was statewide recycling, which we didn't have before. And so we were able to get all the people together and ask people what they want. I mean, part of the problem is nobody asks questions these days, and nobody asks the other side, what is it that you're trying to achieve? What is it that you're trying to get out of it? And I think if you show people the respect of asking them what they care about, what are their biggest concerns, there's a much better chance you'll actually get somewhere.
One of the questions that brings to mind for me is how you get people to the kind of attitude where they will engage in these kinds of conversations, where they will have, one of the things we do in our Rodell program, as you all know, is that, the thing we bring together people like you all and Gabby Giffords and Lisa Madigan and others and have a conversation around the table where the idea is to listen to each other and to engage without preconceptions. We don't talk about issues where you might already have a locked-in position, so we talk about Aristotle and Hobbes and Locke and all these, so that you're able to think anew. And one of the questions, Trey, you made a point. You've kind of you've moved temporarily, I hope, out of the political realm and into the academic realm, the educational realm. But a lot of the most prominent people in American society are beginning to turn their attention to civic education, to dealing with the fact that we have so many of the people in our society today who have not been grounded in understanding the political dynamic, the system we operate in, how a democracy works. And, during the time, I shouldn't say it, it's your new home at Harvard, but, the years I taught at Harvard, there were a lot of courses about how to do economic studies and so forth, but very little about politics and governance and so forth. So how do you deal, what you do now at the Institute of Politics is to bring young people through the system, and how do we create this new civic engagement that has been missing for a lot of people in their education process?
Well, one of the things that we do at the IOP is every semester we do a survey of young Americans, not just Harvard kids, 18 to 29-year-olds from all across America, and we do it on the internet because that's where these people live. You can't call them. About 75% don't have landlines. One of the things that's been true in the 10-plus years we've been doing this survey, every semester when we do the survey, we're no longer surprised by this finding, is that there's a huge disconnect between public service and politics. That when you ask these students, or they ask these young people, no matter how you phrase it, being an elected official, running for office is really low on the totem pole, and in some cases isn't even thought of as public service. And we find that even at Harvard, among our students, trying to get our students, almost all of them who do some type of community service, to come hear great speakers and meet our great fellows and come down and take our money to get a great internship in Washington, D.C., to make that connection between politics and public service. And when I was Secretary of State, one of my big initiatives was to try to restore civics education to the classroom, because the more I learned about how shockingly little these kids know about the federal government, it's scary. And this is one issue, if you're looking for something where you can find some bipartisan consensus, this is probably one of them, where I think most people recognize this as an issue. I addressed a group of mayors, of city officials a couple of weeks ago at the National League of Cities, and I said, they don't know anything about the federal government. They know nothing about how city government works. I mean, it is really shocking. And so I think one of the challenges we face is if you're trying to get people to believe in the system and they don't understand how the system works, you're not even over the threshold there. And it is something that we as a country need to do a better job, and we have some programs where we try to work on it at our school and nationally. But it's something that, if you're looking for something concrete, the hardest thing about all these discussions is we all agree, everybody in this room anyway, agrees civility is a problem right now. Maybe not, we're not caning people and shooting people, but it's a problem. But we're looking for solutions. I think improving civic education in the classroom is an easy one to pursue because there's a lot of consensus about it, and it's something I think we could make a positive difference.
But in terms of getting people in public office to listen to each other, I mean, that's where, when people ask, is it different from when you were growing up? And Linda, Rob, and I grew up together in this town, and it is very different from when we were growing up. And the big difference is that people were friends. I mean, what the governor was saying was true in Delaware was true in Washington for everybody who was in Congress. So people knew each other, people spent a huge amount of time with each other. We were all at church together or PTA together or whatever it was. And then there were also congressional trips. And, it wasn't always called a junket. And people went together abroad and got to know each other in a completely different way. And then became much more interested in listening to each other and hearing what they had to say. I was so struck by some of the freshmen coming in now saying, I met Nancy Pelosi and she's actually a nice person. Like that was some surprise. They really did think she had horns and under the hair. And so I do think that that aspect is a very strong aspect of just getting people to know each other. And if there's any kind of way of making that happen, it's so easy, really, just to find out that somebody's a human being and whose ideas should be solicited.
I was going to go back to you anyway, Cokie, because I want you to try to get some. You have not only the journalistic background, but as you said, when you and Linda were here in town, watching the system work. But if, in fact, the incivility is not quite at the level it was during Hamilton's day, there are some real clear differences. For example, take two of the more controversial people who have served on the Supreme Court, Felix Frankfurter and William O. Douglas, both confirmed almost unanimously. The Eisenhower's interstate highway system, which bypassed communities and created great controversy, passed overwhelmingly. Medicare, majorities of both parties supporting it. Now you see
that was a tough one.
Yeah, but now you see, Kagan and Sotomayor, all of one party is on one side, all of the other parties on the other side. So if the incivility is not at the level perhaps that it once was, why is this inability to come together? Because there were divisions then. There were strong disagreements, but people found a way to come together and work them out. So what's the missing
Well,
piece
some
this
of it is
time?
what I was just saying, was that they knew each other better and were better friends. Some of it was that there were certain expectations. We shouldn't take that whole period. And I do think that the post-World War II period was aberrant rather than the norm. And I think the war had everything to do with it, that people were literally in the trenches together. And you had those enormous freshman classes. You had that huge Republican class of 46 and the huge Democratic class of 48, and all of them were veterans. And so they were self-conscious veterans. They ran as the men who went, not the men who sent. And so they truly did believe that, that arguments stopped at the water's edge. Now, McCarthy was around, so you can't, pretend that it was all sweetness and light. There were some very tough periods in that whole time as well. But so I do think some of it is just a question of, the experiences that generation had and the experiences that were taking place in this city in terms of friendship. The other thing I think that is huge is redistricting. And of course, we've always had gerrymandering, but the difference now with computers is that basically members of Congress can pick their voters rather than voters picking their members of Congress, and that elects the most polarized people, and those people from the House go to the Senate and bring their attitudes to the Senate with them, so that it has become much less of a cooling off place than it used to be, and I think that affects the votes on Supreme Court justices, along with what's coming up from the body politic.
Well, let me suggest that we do this. We could do this because I love listening to all of you. We have around this table, from members of the House, the Senate, academics, people who have done all of this, So what I want to do is I'm going to come to you. If you want to be recognized, just put your little card up, with the name facing me so I can see who you are. And the same thing, make your questions brief or comments, free to do that. Anyway, so Senator Bennett, let's start with you.
Go on, there we go. I agree with Cokie absolutely that redistricting is a major, major problem. I will be very interested to see what happens in California. A, they're going to draw their districts different, and B, they now have an open primary so that the zealots cannot dominate the primary the way they traditionally have. I've lived in California, and it is the least responsive of any democracy I have ever seen. Now, I've not lived overseas, but California comes close. And state legislature, national representatives, everything, they are set in their incumbency, safe in their incumbency, and dependent entirely on what happens in a very small primary in order to keep that seat. So I think we watch that. Back to some of the other two comments, the other two items that have been raised. The least attractive high school course with the heaviest textbook is history. You carry a 12-pound book around with you that is absolutely impenetrable to anyone who understands the English language. And it is filled with compromises that have been made by scholars who have written it solely for the selecting committee of whatever school district it is, so they make sure they don't say anything that the selecting committee won't like, and they fill it with facts that are completely meaningless in today's world. As one scholar put it, the only time I have ever been called upon to remember the name of Columbus's 3 ships was when I was taking a test in history. I can add to that it helps with a crossword puzzle on occasion. The teaching of American history in this fashion has created a nation of historical illiterates in a nation that survives solely because of its ideas and its history. We are not a nation built upon a tribe, the way every other nation in the world is. We have no single tribal identity to which we can automatically refer. We are a nation built upon an idea that has attracted immigrants from every tribe, and we bury that idea as deeply as we possibly can in impenetrable activity. I recommend to everybody, I've forgotten the author, but there's a wonderful book entitled Lies My Teacher Taught Me, and it's about American history texts. I do not agree with everything the author says, but that's one place that we want to start. Now, you talk about the Supreme Court justice and why do they get confirmed unanimously, and then now it's a very close vote. As recently as Clarence Thomas, he was confirmed 52-48, and there was not a thought in anybody's mind of a filibuster. The requirement that he would have to have 60 votes never occurred to anybody. John's here, and he can testify to that. The challenge is not what the change has occurred in the Senate. The challenge is what change has occurred among the elected. It now matters to the voters who gets on the Supreme Court. And so, take a name, my colleague, Orrin Hatch, who prided himself on never having voted against a Supreme Court nominee, if he wanted to survive in the state of Utah, which he does, has now voted against 2 Supreme Court nominees for whom he has as much respect, if not more, than the nominees for which he voted previously. But the electorate now, it's a litmus test of where you are in the Supreme Court, and the politicians always end up following the voters, which I can end up harks back to my first statement that we need to work a whole lot harder in helping our voters, not just to understand civility or civics or the way the thing works, but understand the amazing story that is America, the amazing concept that is America, and their responsibility. You talk about public service, their responsibility. I end with the statement my high school teacher put into all of us. She was the kind of tyrant in the class that would tolerate absolutely nothing but complete attention. And she used to point her bony finger and say, "Bob, pay attention. In a few short years, your vote will count as much as mine." And that was always terrifying to us, that we would be able to vote as much as Mrs. Whitcomb could. But she put it into every high school student's head and heart, a reverence for America. Yeah.
100. Yes. Senator Warner is next.
Well, don't let the Senate dominate any conference. But I have to depart for another engagement. I'm surprised that this very erudite and I think excellent panel have not talked about the 500-pound gorilla in this room, and that's money. When I came to the Senate in 1978, elected, took office 79, I had an unusual race, so it really isn't a benchmark, but less than $1 million. I'm not involved in partisan politics anymore. I stepped down after 50 years involved in it, but I naturally have an intellectual curiosity. The forthcoming Senate race in Virginia between 2 very strong, qualified, quite different individuals, projections are $25 to $30 million at each. Now that translates in an enormous amount of time it takes to raise that money. And to answer the very astute observation, he who shouts the loudest often wins. And with today's multiple forms of media, it is very expensive. Now back to the transitions that I saw in the Senate. When I came, there were about, say, 7 strong Democratic chairmen at that time, Democrats, and 7 very strong Republican leadership, most of them ranking members and so forth. They got together. They had a drink together in the evening. I remember one of them, when you had a nomination for the court, you wanted to discuss it with that chairman, you went to his office at 5 o'clock, the meeting started with a glass of scotch or bourbon. Not that everybody was drinking all the time, but it was a very cordial way to start a discussion. Families, I think, Bob, I would say 80% of them, when I came, had their wives here in town. Now the families tend to stay at home, far fewer wives, and wives are a very important means by which after hours senators get together and go down to the dining room, and it was a rule at the table, Democrats and Republicans, forget what you said on the floor, we'll talk here. They don't come because the senator, be he male, female, or otherwise, has to cross the country raising money, either for their own election or party pressures required to do it for someone else. They're on the road. The Senate used to work a lot longer when I was there, and I worry about the concept of our founding fathers of 3 co-equal bodies. And when one leg of that 3-cornered stool gets weak because it doesn't have the time to do its work or reconcile to do its work, the stool tilts. And where does the power go? To the executive branch. So there's a lot to be said about this, and I won't blather on any longer. But it is a subject that should be addressed in fora like this across the country and spread it out. I try to be active in it. I'm forthcoming to opportunities that I've accepted to do that. We need to devote the time and search for the answers. Is it less civil today than when I was there? Yes, because those 7 or 8 strong Democrats and Republicans, when you went to the Senate, lovely to have you, Senator. Take your seat. When we're ready to hear from you, we'll let you make your maiden speech. And when you went into committee rooms, you were at the end of the table. They saw you. Occasionally they recognized you. You took your turn in line. You learned the system carefully before you began to throw the sharp elbows that are being thrown today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think what you said reminded me of the point that Cokie made, that the way the change has come about, that so many of the people who were in the House and grew up in the House with the sharp elbows and the swinging fists then went over to the Senate, and both bodies now look more and more alike. Here's who I have on the list at this point: Sean, Connie, Norm, Brad, and Scott. So, you know, let's Sean. By the way, Sean and I are writing a book together, so glad you're here. Sean was the author of one of the top books on party polarization.
Great.
From University of Texas.
It's a privilege for me to be here. I'm a professor at the University of Texas, and I just wanted to add 3 small points, and hopefully this will enlighten the conversation a little bit. The first is I think we have a tendency too much to blame redistricting. And the only evidence that I would point to us is questioning the effects of redistricting is looking at the elections in 2006 and 2008 that brought huge Democratic majorities, and then the election in the exact same districts in 2010 that brought huge majorities to the Republicans. So I'm just not certain that truly redistricting can be the cause of the problem in as much as we frequently want to say it is. The second thing that I would add is that I'm writing a book now, excuse the plug, but it's called the Gingrich Senators. And I'm looking exactly at these members who went from the House serving with Newt Gingrich into the Senate. And my argument is that they've radically transformed the Senate, and so it looks much more like an institution like the House. And part of what my research is finding is these folks, there's been 39 of them, 22 of them who currently still serve in the Senate, is that they're more conservative, obviously, than the average Republican serving in the Senate. And that they're able to survive their elections because they're able to raise more money. So the reason they're winning the first time is because they have much bigger war chests, which allows them to have a little bit more freedom in casting votes. And every subsequent election, they have more money, and so they're able to hang on. And finally, the third comment that I would just add to the conversation is that perhaps the worst thing that happened to civility in Congress is in 1980 with the Senate and 1994 with the House. And that was when the Republicans realized that they weren't a permanent minority. It gave them incentives to do things that they previously wouldn't do. And so now we used to think that we had a season of elections and then a season of governing and then a season of elections. And what we see now is that there's no distinction between those seasons. And so when people come to Washington, D.C., presumably to solve problems, what they're doing is setting the stage for the next election. And the reason they're able to do that is because every election, it seems like the House or the Senate could swing either way. And so there's an incentive to try and portray your enemies, your opponents, in the worst possible light to damage their election prospects. So I'll just offer those and
part of I just agree with you for a second, Connie, because part of what you're seeing there is who was nominated is the question when you're talking about redistricting. So if you're going to have a wave election, you're going to have a wave election, but who is the candidate then? That's what the redistricting affects.
In addition to that, I'm glad the money chase has been brought up, because I think that has a tremendous influence. And of course, the fact that people don't know each other. But, I think we're in a society, and I think the media has helped to contribute to it, where it's an instant society. I want what I want when I want it, and if I don't get it, I'll tear the place down. And I think that's what you're finding with the Web 2.0. I mean, the blogging, well, Facebook, I know despite that poll that you unraveled, Facebook, texting, all these kinds of things I think are contributing to sometimes misinformation being spread, multiplying, and then you take people who are unhappy with something, and so they jump on it, and that just kind of continues and exacerbates the whole situation and enlarges it even more. So I think the concept of the responsibility of the media and how do you handle information technology, which is moving so fast. When someone said, hey, Morella, your BlackBerry is Stone Age. That's true. That's really true. So we're moving ahead, and I don't know that we're ready for it or how we handle it.
If I could chime in for a second about an anecdote from my experience last year is what was striking to me, and he sort of faded from the popularity a little bit and his show's going off the air, but when I was campaigning last year in the Senate, it struck me that whatever Glenn Beck talked about the night before or talked about on that radio that day was what I would often get asked about that night. I didn't have time because I was too busy raising money and doing my day job plus I didn't really like him, to listen to Glenn Beck or watch Glenn Beck. And so I had to subscribe to his daily email because it kind of was a summary of what was on his mind. So I would be able to be prepared to answer questions or that he's going to raise in the minds of his listeners and his viewers on election. It was striking, and it sort of was at that moment. I think early 10 and late 09 was sort of his peak of his power, I believe. But it's really striking. I don't know, Senator, if you've had that same experience, in the run up to your convention.
There is no question about it, and I would make this point. Well, I agree with what John has said. I had all the money. I had the organization. I had the establishment. None of my opponents had a dime, but they had the internet, and they had Glenn Beck, and they had a narrow constituency in the convention, and we blew it completely because the entire election was fought in social media away from anybody watching a television set other than the Glenn Beck show. And when our organization showed up and we had traditional ads and we had a traditional campaign, these people were all motivated by what they had heard on the wildest of shows and what they had read on the wildest of blogs. One of my opponents, I had 7, one of my opponents made the core of his argument he would not accept a salary and he would not accept the lifetime at full salary pension that is available to every member of Congress after one term. And everybody believed him that that was indeed what I was getting, and therefore they had to get rid of me. And here was a man who said his whole campaign was, I won't accept those things. And when I pointed out to him that those things didn't exist, it didn't change his campaign a bit.
Now it's, you know, maybe some people listen to Glenn Beck to get their information. I listen to Norm Ornstein. So, you know, Norm.
Bless you, Mickey. I will, in reference to Bob's last statement, I've had several smart, responsible people forward me that scurrilous email that's been out there now for a couple of years, going through all of these things about what members of Congress have that are utterly false, but people see it and they believe it. A couple of quick comments. First, an advertisement on redistricting. Tom Mann at Brookings, Michael McDonald at George Mason, Micah Altman at Harvard, and I have created this open source program that allows anybody to create districts and do them according to a whole variety of values, from compactness to competitiveness. We just did a contest with 15 colleges creating teams in Virginia. One of the maps for Congress was actually embraced by the Independent Powerless Commission that the governors created. But there is a chance that they'll gridlock there and a court will make the decisions, and the court now has a plan. So I just would ask anybody who can help us out. We'd like to replicate this in other states. Transparency is the only other mechanism we have available to us. A comment on the money. It didn't matter in Bob Bennett's case so much. What I fear is that the corrosiveness of the money chase not only distorts the legislative process. You watch the House and Senate now, and whenever there's an odd moment, people are streaming off the campus to do call time. We are distorting and narrowing the base of potential candidates, of people who are willing to run. And it's not just the money, it's the campaigns now too. You put yourself up and your reputation is stripped away before your very eyes, and you spend all of your time debasing yourself, raising money. It is a miracle that we get good people like some of the ones around this room who are willing to put themselves up for it. You get ideologues and demagogues and people whose only interest is advancing their political careers, and it becomes much harder. A comment on the trips. I was really depressed to see, we're in the 2-week recess, lots of trips abroad. Almost all of them are single party now. It doesn't always work that way, but even the Senate trips, McConnell is off in Asia, it's all Republican senators. So even that opportunity is starting to go by the boards, and that's difficult. Now, a few other comments. Mickey asked whether it matters. I believe it matters enormously, because the basic task of governing, if you boil it down, is you are trying to get voters to accept short-term pain for the promise, or if come maybe, of long-term gain. Now, human nature does not easily accept the immediacy of pain for the promise of gain. And we do it if authority figures tell us we have to do it, if our gastroenterologist or our dentist tells us. It's always difficult for politicians. But it's become much more difficult now, and solving major problems that do not have broad leadership consensus creates a corrosiveness. So even when you pass things, you have a completely divided country. And we are now we don't have a tribe, Bob, but we have tribal politics. And who proposes something matters more than what is proposed. So I look now at the surrealness. John Cornyn, in a burst of candor the other day, said, well, Paul Ryan's exchanges are exactly the same as those in the Affordable Care Act. The ones that I went back and looked at some of the statements on the floor of the Senate were a step right down the road to socialism back then, but now they free up people. Every single cut in Medicare that generated the Health Care Bill of Rights to protect seniors from being devastated over the next 10 years that were said to precipitate at least 20% of hospitals closing are in the Ryan plan. So who proposes it matters more. And it means that you have almost no opportunity to find a way to get to common ground, which has less to do with policy, even though we have very stark policy differences, than with anything else. And of course, you could see it in the fact that Bob Bennett and Ron Wyden bridged that gap and came up with a plan that was a hell of a lot better than the one that ultimately passed. Yes. And so that's health care. And now we face a great challenge where 70% of Americans say, bring on a breach in the debt limit, and where a vast majority won't accept any of the difficult cuts that have to be made across any area to deal with the burgeoning debt problem. You can deal with that if you have bipartisan leadership consensus that says to people, trust us, this has to be done. If you get these issues breaking down along tribal lines, then the consequences, I would say, are extraordinary and severe, and more than they were even in many periods in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, just a couple of other things. I do think the permanent campaign that Sean alluded to is a driver of all of this, and that much of that post-war period, we had no question in any given election about who was going to be in the majority the next time around. Well, from 54 on for 40 years, we didn't have that, and now we do every time, and that is a driver of a lot of this. And so what can we do about it other than looking at the California open primary system, or my #1 topic on the wish list, which has zero chance, which is the Australian system of mandatory attendance at the polls? I would just bring up my other hobby horse. Move Congress to a 3 weeks on, 1 week off schedule, 5 days a week, 9 a.m. Monday to 5 p.m. Friday, 1 week to go back home and deal with constituents. And by the way, during the 15 days in session, no fundraising. 15 days a month ought to be enough to do that. And at the same time, I would like to build very nice apartment buildings on the old grounds where the Carroll Arms Hotel and the Congressional Hotel were, and offer them at cost with substantial rooms, daycare or child care facilities, and an open dining hall to members of Congress. I talked to a group of freshman senators coming in this time who wanted to move their families here and have children. And we're talking about what kind of housing they could afford, keeping a house back home that was relatively close to the Capitol, had halfway decent schools. And if you don't have a Capitol base, you simply can't do it. So you've got to find a way to provide an inducement for people to come to town and to interact together to get that small town atmosphere that you've got in Delaware that used to exist on Capitol Hill. It's not enough given all the other factors, but it's a necessary step, I believe.
I thought you were going to have us all move to Des Moines, but let me, I'm going to turn to Jack for a second, but let me ask, there's so much talent around here and so much experience that ask that you kind of keep your remarks brief, because I've got 11 more people on this list, and every one of them is somebody you want to hear from. So, yeah, Jack, you go to them.
Very briefly, in the last few minutes we've talked about two very troubling things. One is the money, and the second are the kind of baseless facts that are thrown around, or not facts, like in the case of Senator Bennett. And what's most troubling is that they are mutually reinforcing. And so Michelle Bachmann can get on TV and talk about the fact that when the president went to India, he had the entire U.S. Navy, and it cost many billions of dollars there to protect them. Of course, that was based on some unknown blogger in India, and was absolutely untrue, who turns out to raise so much money in the next cycle, in the next quarter, is Michelle Bachmann. Christine O'Donnell in Delaware, I mean, I heard her with her own words say that Mike Castle voted for the stimulus. He did not. It was a campaign of unbelievable lies, and she raises $7 million. And the problem is therefore, if you are a candidate, the more outrageous you are, facts don't matter. And in fact, the more outrageous you are, the more likely it is you're going to be able to raise the money that you need to wage a credible campaign.
Let me, just so you know, that I actually do have a list. Brad, you're next, and then we've got Scott, Paul, Charlie, Chris, Crochet, John 48, Don Wolfensberger, Linda, Rob, Sanjeev, Melanie, and Kristen. So if you will, kind of keep it a little bit brief. Brad.
I'll do my best. Thank you, Congressman. My name is Brad Fitch. I'm president and CEO of the Congressional Management Foundation, and we have the advantage for 34 years of doing programs with members, but primarily staff, to help on management issues. One chief of staff said to me, a CMF event is where chiefs of staff can leave their weapons at the door. So we are one of the few bipartisan, nonpartisan locations, and I want to share with you a bit of a case study that might lead to some solutions and some ideas here. In 2007, CMF hosted a series of events with Senate chiefs of staff. There were over 20 events during the year, culminating in a retreat in Philadelphia that was hosted by the Pew Charitable Trust. And there was food and drinking involved, and that was one of the requirements that the chiefs of staff gave us, and we supplied it happily. But out of that, we studied this, and CMF is now getting into this area of looking at civility, and we found there were 3 common factors that led to relationships, and that's what it's all about. One was, this was sustained. This was not something that happened one time like the house retreats happen when there are once every 2 years. I mean, once around the dance floor, once every 2 years between Nancy Pelosi and Dennis Hastert isn't going to make a relationship. Second, they were done in small groups of people who had some affinity to one another other than party politics. In this particular case, they were trying to run offices. There was a recent article that was done in Politico that I would all commend to your reading on the women senators who have been secretly getting together. Which was fascinating, and I don't know what it says about civility and gender as well, but I'll put that aside for a second. They had 3 rules, by the way: no notes, no reporters, and no men, which again might lead to civility as well. And the third thing that we learned from this is, and it's been said here in other ways, but said succinctly, social relationships lead to legislative relationships. I can point to you legislation that came out of those 2007 retreats, and so what we're doing right now is we're working with Faith and Politics Institute, which also has a reputation for doing nonpartisan events, to see if we can replicate that model with affinity groups of members of Congress who have some connection to one another. It could be that they're former baseball players in college. It could be their parents of small children. It could be their Civil War historians. We don't know what it's going to be, but we want to try to replicate that model on a smaller basis, study it by doing research on the front end and back end to hopefully see if that's a scalable model for building civility and relationships in Congress.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Scott.
I'll be brief as well. Scott Beal, run an international nonprofit called Atlas Accords, a leadership development program. I'm also a proud Delawarean, and I've always felt that Delaware's got great politics because you can't redistrict that state. And we've made great politicians and leaders too, but I really do think redistricting is a huge issue. And I think especially for younger voters and for millennials who tend to be a little bit less partisan, districting tends to make the candidates more partisan, which also decreases turnout. And I'm not an expert on this, so I guess my question or my comment is, how do we end up going about fixing this? And maybe I can talk to Trey Grayson about it at a later time, but what can be done, and whether it's the open primary or the courts, or I just don't see the instant runoff voting, ranked choice voting. I don't know what the solution is, and I think we need to design some solutions that are also thinking towards younger voters, younger citizens, so we can build it for the long term.
Yeah, that's good. By the way, I have an article, if other people are going to promote, I've got an article coming out of the Atlantic with some solutions that deal with redistricting, that deal with party primaries, even with committee assignment jobs in the Congress. Ambassador Russo. Paul.
Thank you. I'm in the redistricting group, and I agree with so many of the things that you've been talking about, the education and the idealism that has been going through the crowd here. But it occurs to me that that is a long process. It's an education process. It's really going against the coarseness of the society. And my experience in politics, a lot of it with Mickey Edwards, was it's a practical business. And that's why I think the redistricting is the easiest way to get at this problem, because if you make it practical for someone to get reelected, then that's what they're going to do. And it doesn't matter about idealism or whatever, but the intent of that candidate or office holder is to get, in general, to get reelected. And if we're keeping it in such a small group that they have to be a certain personality type and they have to be very narrow in their philosophy, then they cannot get out of that box. They're trapped. And so therefore, that's what you get here. And then your point about that goes to the Senate. I just don't see any other way. And your point, Cokie, also about the technology, and I think that's what's changed. I'm not a technology person, but I'm being told from the people I talk to that you can figure out every single person in your district, in a district, and put them all together. So if you win in that district, you cannot come down here and say, I'd like to compromise on this, or I'd like to say, well, give me half a loaf, or whatever it might be. And as I say, I guess Norm said there's a project right now on redistricting, but I think that groups like this that would get involved in the short term of the redistricting side, and also in the long term of going toward the more idealistic form. I mean, we've got a wonderful system, but we're trying to kill it. And as I say, I just want to add my voice to the redistricting side. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Let me throw in here that one of the things we have to look at as we go forward, there are a lot of the reforms that backfire. We've had to reform more and more transparency in Congress. And I've had many examples in the conference committees between the House and Senate when transparency made it impossible to compromise. You know, it just kills it. So the next two I have are Charlie Firestone and Chris Shays. Charlie.
Thank you, Mickey. So I run the Communications and Society program at the Aspen Institute, so I'll talk a little bit about, I'll get to media hopefully very quickly, but I want to key off of Cokie, your early comment about how people act differently personally and politically. And I think people do act differently in groups. And I want to relate that to just the golden rule, that people generally talk about the golden rule and they act according to the golden rule, hopefully the golden rule. But in politics, or in democracy, as Harding Carter once taught me, really a definition of democracy is ruling as if you will not be in power one day. It's kind of a political golden rule. And it doesn't seem like that's happening today, that people don't imagine that they're going to be out of power. And although Norm said, you know, that it does shift, you would think that there would be more of that. So if they did, maybe there would be a little more civility and more rationality because you're not going to be it. So what might be some of the, real quickly, I'll do this, causes and where might we look? One is natural psychology. I think people do act differently in groups, and that's a psychological thing that I haven't looked into carefully, but I'd like to. Secondly, I think the media, we've talked about the media a number of times. I think the talk radio atmosphere, it's about 10-to-1 conservative to liberal shows. But despite the politics, it's just a very negative attitude about what government is doing to you. It's sort of a paranoia that, you know, if you sit and listen to it day in and day out, and it's not just once and, you know, somebody's idea, it is day in, day out, hour after hour of negativity about government. So, you know, those who listen to it are reinforcing that. But what is my optimism is in social media. And so, Connie, I would, though I was a constituent of yours and often agree with you, I actually disagree about Facebook. Facebook is not anonymous. People, what social media does is give people your opinions. You know, what you do is you say, hey, take a look at this, take a look at that. Well, that's you putting your mark on something. And it's not just taking pot shots, so that you're sharing your beliefs. Now, people may have, you know, we feel that people may have some crazy beliefs, but by and large, I'm actually encouraged by the prospects of what something like some social media, and Facebook, which is obviously by far the largest, has an opportunity to give us. Which leads to my ultimate place where I'm paying more and more attention myself, and I feel is most important, is our responsibilities of citizenship. And you talked about civic education, which I totally think is correct, but we have to really build civic education. You know, there's the textbook, and if you've seen a civics textbook, it's almost as big as the history textbook, and probably just as impenetrable. But we really do need a spirit of citizenship where people will take their personal responsibilities. Because in the end, all this goes back to the voter. And if people acted responsibly, the representative was going to act responsibly. And so I think we need to just think about how we use new media to instill citizenship as well as civic education in the schools, and just think about it in new ways. Thank you.
The next four are Chris Shays, John Fortier, Don Wilkinsberger, and Rob.
Thank you. I came a little bit late, but there's so many comments. I buy into almost all of them because I don't think there's a lot of disagreement. I'll just start by saying thank goodness for C-SPAN times 10. Thank goodness for you, Cokie, because for years you basically told things the way they were, and as a member of Congress, I thought how refreshing. Thank goodness for you, Linda. You have been gracious from day one, and I think of children growing up with very important politicians and what they have to deal with. And Senator Bennett, for you, because I just wept when you lost, and I just love the way you dealt with it. And Mike Castle was my best friend. I thought, hell, if we can't elect Mike Castle, we're in deep shit. But I'd make these other points. Tell the American people the truth, and they'll usually have you do the right thing. But the opposite of truth now, it's just blatant lies. And unfortunately, it's hard to counter it. Secondly, I would just say the Vietnam War and Watergate really made people cynical and suspicious and had a huge change in our outlook. I rejoiced when Nixon was forced to resign, and I almost thought him as a demon until I read the book about, his daughter wrote a book about her mom. And it's a sweet story about Nixon and his wife and Pat. I wept reading it, thinking, how could I be filled with so much hate? And I realized, I was part of that process. Secondly, I would say, it's not just that you have to raise money, it's you got to raise money for your party, and if you're a chairman, you've got to come up with $1.5 million or $2 million. That would have used to be viewed as illegal, but it's not illegal anymore. But if we think 40 years were the good old days of one-party rule, that's not right. Now, the way Newt did it is he blew up the place. He was like the colonel of Vietnam. He just said, just shower the bombs on me. I don't care, the VC are all around me. But, remember, Bob Michael was given that wonderful office that the Speaker had, so the Republican leadership were very content. Everything was nice. When I was part of that new majority, we didn't know how to be in the majority for a year, and the Democrats didn't know how to be in the minority. And then all of a sudden they began, my God, this is competitive. So I have this ambivalent feeling. The way we got in was we blew up the place, but it should be a competitive process. In terms of reapportionment, I don't buy your argument that's not a factor because I'm with Connie. That was so cataclysmic that if they had really reapportioned, well, you probably would have had twice as many new members elected. That was such an unusual event, just like 74 and just like the bank scandal and so on. It shouldn't take a bank scandal or that to be a factor. I make this 2 more points. The social issues seem to matter. You can be right on gun control, you can be right on abortion, but you can be wrong on how you run the freaking government. We got a country to run, and while Rome is burning, we're eating grapes. You can be the most incompetent member of Congress, allowing us to have huge deficits, but if you're right on some social issues, that seems to make a difference. And I'll make 2 more points. There's a book called Thumping that nobody seemed to want to read, and it was about Rahm Emanuel and how the Democrats took control. 3 basic themes. The first was no invention of his. Find dirt on your opponent and use it. The second theme was make life so miserable for your opponent that they or your family don't want to run. So my house is picketed, picketed by Acorn. And there's a point where my wife says, sweetheart, I don't know if I want you to run again. And then the last point is, I could never understand, people could disagree with my votes, but all of a sudden I started reading that my character was in question. Congressman Shea said this, but he did this. And it was just baloney. And I thought, what am I doing wrong? That people would all, and then I realized it was some of the same people. And when you read Thumping, you realize the last theme of the book was, have people question the integrity of the candidate. And it's what happened to Chris Dodd. Once people thought his integrity was lost, he could spend as much money, but he was dead. And all of a sudden, my integrity became the issue. And it was a sophisticated plan done by one party, and I'm sure both parties do it. And so, you know, it's a lot of these things, and they all add up to be pretty significant.
John.
It's a comment or sort of question for the panel. We've been talking about polarization and the things that might overcome it. And the one thing I guess we've alluded to but haven't really put on the table is that, you know, the parties have changed very significantly, and there used to be, you know, a lot more opportunity for cross-party coalition, or much more in common for some Republicans to join with Democrats. And so a lot of these reforms of committees working together or people having common interests depended a bit on having some common values. And look at all the panel, all four of you are from states that have kind of made journeys, right? Delaware being somewhat more of a Republican state, moving to kind of a more Democratic state, still having some moderates left, and the three from conservative Democratic states. There seem to be some opportunities for this civility and getting along in this interim period. But how do you create it when you have now very few in the middle, very few opportunities for people actually agreeing on things politically?
I think that is such an important point. I mean, there was a recent study on this where, you know, the overlap among what used to be conservative Democrats and moderate Republicans was significant, and now there's none whatsoever in the Senate. There's no overlap.
Yeah, we saw the Ron Brown did that great study a couple weeks ago where my former Congressman Ken Lucas, who was a conservative Democrat, is, you know, there aren't people like him anymore. And the gap between the parties is as big as it's ever been. I mean, I will say, if we're looking for a green sprout, in the Senate, the folks who were on that bipartisan, on the Simpson Bowles Commission, you've got Dick Durbin and Tom Coburn agreeing essentially on that plan and continuing to work together. If Dick Durbin and Tom Coburn can agree on something, that's a positive sign. Now, can they get to 60? Can they get it through the House with the President's signature and it's a tall order? But that's one where they don't have a lot of overlap, but they decide this is a big enough situation, big enough problem in the country to face. They were both willing to give a little and sign on to something that could hurt their political career. I mean, both of them would be vulnerable to primary challenges in their own states, yet they did it anyway.
Well, I think first of all, you got to find somebody else to take a leap of faith with. Maybe not, and sometimes you can do it on your own, but it's a lot better if you can find somebody else from the other party to take a leap of faith with. And I think it's really incumbent upon us to point out that we are so poorly served by the false choices that are out there. I mean, for my party, it's so much about all the corporate evil doing, it's about all the excess executive compensation. And so oftentimes for the Republicans, it's all about the fact that government can't get anything right. Now, of course, I mean, the truth is, none of that is true. And so, I mean, I think some of us have to stand up and say, what is the core value that all of us can agree on? And for me, and when we think about this country, if we had to really say, where should we always be able to agree? It's about opportunity. It's about giving every American the opportunity to go as far as their potential will take. I mean, that's the core value. And the problem is, I think we've so often lost sight of what our shared and core values are. And to me, that's where you have to start.
What I'm going to try to do, our closing time is a little flexible. If we can get through all the people who have said they want to speak, I hope we can. So it's Don Wolfensberger, Linda Robb, Sanjeev, Melanie, Kristen, Kay, and Lloyd. And then we'll see if we can do that. You know, Don.
Okay, Don Wolfensberger with the Woodrow Wilson Center. Two quick snapshots and a comment. 1964, I was at the Republican convention. Mickey mentioned Goldwater and Johnson. Keep in mind that Goldwater and Kennedy, before Kennedy was assassinated, agreed they're going to have debates around the country, which is the ultimate of civility, I think. But I was in the gallery then. I was both a reporter for giving color for a local weekly in the Chicago area, as well as a youth Observer, and Eisenhower got up and made his comment about the sensation-seeking columnists and commentators, and that's how he pronounced it. And my jaw dropped when the delegates got up and turned around and were shaking their fist at the anchor booths. And here was poor Walter Cronkite saying, "What the heck was that about?" And I'm saying the same thing because at that point, journalism was my chosen career. Fast forward 11 years, I'm working with John Anderson, who is working with Bernie Sisk. I'm working with Sisk's chief of staff, a guy named Tony Coelho, on getting broadcasting in the House of Representatives. And the biggest testimony against it wasn't that widespread, was once you introduce television into the House of Representatives, the networks are only going to grab the most sensational parts where people are calling each other names, and that's what's going to be broadcast. Well, to an extent, that has been true, but my observation looking back is that members are more tending to stay to their scripts. They're talking past each other. They're not engaging each other. They don't yield to each other anymore. There's no real debate. I don't think there's that much incivility. There's just people that are speaking their ideological party lines and sitting down, and most of the debate is boring, frankly. Thank you.
The thing is that as this is the first, as I said, in a series of meetings that we're doing with the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I hope one of the issues that we're going to look at is parties themselves. You know, the current party system was not ordained in the Constitution. It came out of the progressive movement, and is perhaps come to the point where it does way more harm than it does good. So here's who's left. Sanjeev, Melanie, Kristen, Kay, and Lloyd. So yeah, we'll just stop with those.
Hi, my name is Sanjeev, and I'm a pediatrician, and before I was working at Children's National Medical Center, I was a communications director advocating for health reform. And I guess what those two stories have in common is that I have a comfort with childish behavior. And I think that, you know, a lot has been said about, you know, the lack of relationship building and the consequences of civility, but having done a lot of work with, especially with health reform advocacy, where I would receive calls from doctors who were in favor of it, doctors who were against it, was that it really led me to the conclusion that instead of an information age, it feels like we have a validation age. It feels that people shop for information to validate and confirm, you know, their sense of identity and their sense of belief. And instead, what was supposed to have happened when I was in school and was told that, you know, you need to get, you know, an internet connection because it'll, you know, help you, you know, learn more and, you know, build and fulfill your curiosity, is that I actually find people less curious. And I find, you know, even worse than that is a lack of humility to say the words, "I don't know," and to show a patience with the idea of like, well, I don't know, and I will be patient to learn, and if it requires that I turn around something that I used to really believe in, that might be the consequence of me learning. And that it was really striking to me that physicians of all people were having trouble with this, and it made me realize that if my own colleagues are having trouble with this, I don't know what it means for my fellow citizens, because physicians are supposed to be the first ones to say, oh, well, there's new evidence and we have to turn around an old behavior. And I think that, you know, when I look at, you know, my time having advocated for health reform and I look at the, you know, conversation going on now, I can't help but ask the question, well, what are the consequences of this prolonged incivility? If it keeps going on, what are the consequences? And, you know, when I go back home to California, where, you know, people are, it's a mixed group as far as like who's interested in politics and who isn't. The moment I start talking about, you know, these are the things that I've been, you know, hearing on the Hill about, you know, deficit reduction and this, that, and the other, I see eyes glaze over. And the thing that worries me about it is the lack of civility that people see just sort of like a justification for them to be disgusted, disengaged, and then does that disengagement lead to more misinformation? And then finally you end up with a government that isn't of the people and by the people. It's a government of the people who think that they're very well informed and who have, you know, who were first and, you know, who made it first and made it popular, but didn't necessarily, you know, make themselves accountable or make themselves right or credible. And so that's, you know, one of those things that I'm glad to see this conversation going on and happy to participate. Thanks.
I'm Melanie Sloan. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. And some of you will probably think we're part of the problem with a lack of civility with my guests. I too am from Delaware, actually, and we were very involved in the I know, how likely is that, 3 people in one in Washington? We were very involved in the Christine O'Donnell issue, and I'm glad you're here, Representative Shays, because I hope you can convey to Mr. Castle. I learned later that he felt that we stayed out of the issue with O'Donnell until after he lost. But the truth of the matter was, so to help Chris Coons, but the truth of the matter was, being from Delaware, I could never imagine a case in which Christine O'Donnell could win. I thought it was so clear that it would be Mike Castle because, of course, everyone loved Mike Castle. So it was impossible for me to imagine such a situation. Usually. So anyway, that's why we took a look at her, because she seemed so crazy. But one of the things that I also feel like is a problem and feeds on voter disgust with Washington is there is a lack of accountability by members of Congress, and members only want to hold accountable people from the other party. They'll never say the guy on their side did something bad. And you can see this on both sides. I mean, members of the Senate spoke highly of Ted Stevens, even when he'd been indicted, and whatever you may think of how it all played out, there was a fair amount of evidence that Ted Stevens had done something wrong. And you could see the same thing, say this exact same thing about members who supported Charlie Rangel. And I remember talking to donors who were not very happy with me when I was very critical of Nancy Pelosi for being very close with and holding fundraisers for William Jefferson after it was found that he had $90,000 in his freezer. And then we had the whole Abramoff scandal where nobody ever said, wow, I was wrong and I am sorry. And I think that that really feeds on some of voters' concerns that nobody ever admits to having made a mistake and they just use it to beat up the other guy.
A very good point, because that also plays off in the separation of powers questions where during the Bush administration, even if the president did things that were clearly unconstitutional, that was fine with his party, and they would have marched in protest, had somebody from the other party done it. Just an opinion. Kristen.
Thank you so much. Mickey, you actually perfectly set up my question just a few minutes ago. I'm sure you did. But my question was, with the parties becoming more polarized, and Cokie, as you mentioned before, how people really just want their representatives to behave, and people in my generation, the millennial generation, are identifying more and more as independent, do you think a two-party system is still relevant, or will we start to move away from that? I'd love to hear the thoughts of Mickey and the rest of the panelists.
Wait till you see my article.
I wanted to set you up for that.
I mean, one of the things you have to recognize is that the two-party system is not at the federal level institutionalized, but it is at the state level. Most states have primaries that are paid for by us taxpayers that are for the two parties, and most legislators are members of those two parties, and they all got elected under that system, and so they got to change the law to open it up. And so there are some real structural advantages to them, at the state legislature. So anytime you're talking about reforms, you got to think a lot of this has to come from the state legislatures. And if you're from a state like mine where there's no possible way of doing a citizen initiative to either change the Constitution or implement a law, I'm not sure that, having watched California become ungovernable that way, I'm okay with that. But there are instances, though, where it'd be nice to have a bypass. So I think that's a structural thing. But what may happen is, it'll be interesting to see in the wake of Citizens United and all these groups that both parties are going to have this election. There was the crossroads the Republicans had. There is a crossroads Democratic counterpart now. Is if that money becomes from the outside, and we talked some about the power of social media. I mean, there may be ways to weaken the party system. In some respects, the party systems themselves are weaker. That's why I'm the director of the IOP, not a member of the United States Senate. This establishment lost control of its own primary and lost. So in some respects, the two-party system might be weaker, but we still may have these same problems with electing the extremes through those rules. If that makes sense.
One of the stories in the past that may or may not be true, there's a professor at Princeton who says it's not, is that politics ended at the water's edge. And I don't know if that's what you were going to talk about, but Kay King from the Council on Foreign Relations was next.
Actually, Mickey, no, I was going to talk a little more generally about, I went to Council on Foreign Relations, and Mickey chaired an advisory group of a study that I did on Congress and national security, and he was a terrific leader, and I thank you for that. What I wanted to say was actually those, especially Senator Warner, who raised the question of money in politics, I think you could do an entire session on that, and I hope you will, especially given Citizens United and the repercussions of that. So first and foremost, I think that's the root of all evil and leads to a lot of the incivility. The other thing I was going to kind of say, that a word I've not heard much around the table today is the word leadership. And I would hope, as part of our education system, civic education, and even the work that think tanks do, that there be more emphasis and focus on leadership, because in a lot of these cases it's going to take real leaders to break through and reach the kind of consensus that needs to be reached to move forward. And then finally, with all due respect to Cokie, I think we need to take a much tougher look at the media. There's been a lot of words thrown around about facts don't matter. Well, the Fourth Estate has a very special role in our country, and I do feel that the media can do a lot to address some of the lack of factual information that's around. And actually, to be fair, but I would also say even the mainstream media has begun to kind of take a lowest common denominator approach to covering issues. And I think, you know, the Donald Trump story is a good example. He's been allowed, just by the things that they choose to put on the air or cover in the newspaper, and it's a kind of coverage of what people, what is entertaining and what gets ratings as against what is serious and important. And since, in fact, the Fourth Estate does have a special role in our society, I do think they have to take a little bit more responsibility for their coverage.
Okay, Lloyd Pearson, former Chief of Staff on the Hill, for me, and top at the Agency for International Development. Lloyd, you got the last word.
I'm a long-time admirer and staff member for Mickey Edwards, and I hope I've learned a few things with him. I think one of the very best things, Mickey, that I have seen in terms of civility firsthand was the bond that you had with Chairman Obey. Two decidedly different types of political philosophies, but the way you were able to work together on foreign operations. I had a federal government agency. We're a federal government corporation called the United States African Development Foundation. We work with the most marginalized, the populations that are most vulnerable in Africa. We are almost always in conflict or post-conflict areas, Somalia, Zimbabwe, widows of genocide in Rwanda, former slave population in Mauritania. We do economic development work among those vulnerable populations. We are affected by the politics in those countries, and what we do see time and again. I was on the line this morning with our staff in Kaduna and Kano in Nigeria. They just had elections. They can't leave their house. There's so many killings. This year in Africa, there are 17 different elections, almost all of them associated in some way with killings and violence. The International Republican Institute and National Democratic Institute deliberately work together overseas, and they've got a great message that I think resonates with us, and that message is that in a democratic society you can differ without killing each other. Time and again, that is the message, despite the political differences, that you can differ, you can argue, you can have different policies, but it's not the trigger finger. And my hero, Congressman Shays, I think, is absolutely right on the elevated character assassination and demonization. But to me, the biggest danger that we have, I don't think the tough politics is ever going to go away. The biggest danger to me is whether this discourse, this lack of civility, leads to violence. And then when that happens, that does take away our message, I think, that resonates all around the world, that you can differ without bullets and guns. And that to me is the biggest danger that we face.
Yeah, thanks, Lloyd. Actually, David Obey and I did not get along until we started traveling together, and things, and one of the things was the rise in attitude from people in the communities attacking members of Congress who travel and do those kinds of things. So a lot of this is a problem in the lack of understanding and resistance by the people in the communities themselves. It's not all from here. Well, I'm glad that this was a great start for the series, and I'm delighted that we're able to work with Jason and the Bipartisan Policy Center in doing this series. I think we've got a lot to look at in the months ahead. So thank you all for coming and participating in it. We appreciate it.